Montana Territory, 1873. The unforgiving frontier had claimed more souls than the local cemetery could hold, and Vaughn Fletcher believed it would claim his too, just not today. The 26-year-old cowboy adjusted his Stetson against the punishing summer sun, his lean frame silhouetted against the vast expanse of grassland that stretched toward the jagged teeth of distant mountains. "A man's only got himself out here," he muttered to his horse, a steady palomino that had witnessed more of Vaughn's private thoughts than any human ever had. "Anything else is just asking for heartbreak or a bullet." 3 years working cattle had hardened his hands but not his features, which remained youthfully handsome despite the elements. His jaw was strong but clean-shaven, his eyes the color of prairie sky after rain. Women in Timber Creek noticed him, but Vaughn maintained his distance, convinced that the frontier demanded solitude from those who wished to survive it. The Double Bar Ranch where he worked was 15 miles outside of town, far enough to keep temptation at bay, close enough to resupply and occasionally drown the silence in whiskey. Ranch work suited him. Honest labor, minimal conversation, and no attachments to complicate matters. Each night he'd fall into exhausted sleep in the bunkhouse, grateful that another day had passed without the complications that came from letting others too close. His parents' graves back in Missouri had taught him young that love was a luxury the West couldn't afford. His father had followed his mother to the grave within a month of her passing, as if his heart couldn't bear to beat without hers nearby. Vaughn had sworn never to become so dependent. "Boss wants us bringing those strays back before sundown," called Hank, an older cowhand with a weathered face that seemed carved from the same wood as the corral posts. "Says there's a storm coming." Vaughn nodded, squinting at the cloudless horizon. "I'll head north toward the creek bed, most likely place they'd wander." As he rode out alone, the familiar rhythm of hoofbeats and creaking leather brought comfort. This was what he understood: tracking cattle, reading skies, measuring distances. People were unpredictable, dangerous, especially to a heart that didn't know how to love halfway. What Vaughn Fletcher couldn't know as he rode out that morning was that his carefully constructed solitude was about to fracture, and with it, everything he believed about survival on the frontier. The stagecoach struggled against the rutted road, jostling its passengers mercilessly. Sophia Nelson clutched her carpetbag, her knuckles white with tension as another bone-jarring bump sent her hat askew. At 22 she had never ventured this far from St. Louis, and the journey had proven more arduous than she'd imagined. Her honey-blonde hair, normally arranged in fashionable waves, had come partially undone from its pins, and her blue calico traveling dress, once crisp and proper, now bore the dust of 3 days' hard travel. Still, there was a quiet determination in her green eyes that the journey couldn't diminish. "Not much farther to Timber Creek, miss," the driver called back through the small window. "Another hour if we're lucky." Sophia managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Luck had been in short supply lately. After her father's sudden death and the revelation that his business dealings had left nothing but debts, she'd been forced to accept her uncle's invitation to Montana. Uncle James had established himself as a successful merchant in Timber Creek, and his letters had painted a picture of opportunity and prosperity that might allow her to rebuild her life. What she hadn't told her uncle was that she was arriving with a broken engagement as well as a broken fortune. Edward, her fiancé of 8 months, had quickly reconsidered his affections when her father's financial ruin became public knowledge. The humiliation still burned. "I need no one," she whispered to herself, smoothing her skirts with trembling fingers. "I shall make my own way." The stagecoach lurched violently, followed by a cracking sound that turned Sophia's blood cold. The driver shouted, horses whinnied in panic, and suddenly the world tilted sideways. She barely had time to brace herself before impact. When Sophia regained her senses, she was sprawled on the floor of the overturned coach, her carpetbag contents scattered everywhere. The other passenger, an elderly gentleman traveling to Helena, was groaning softly. Through the window, now facing skyward, she could see clouds gathering. "You folks all right in there?" the driver's voice came, strained with concern. "We're alive," Sophia called back, helping the elderly man to sit up. "What happened?" "Wheel broke clean off. We're stuck good, miss, and that storm's coming fast." Sophia climbed out with the driver's assistance, surveying the damage. The stagecoach lay tilted at an impossible angle, one wheel completely shattered. Worse still, they were miles from town with darkening skies threatening imminent rain. "I'll need to get help," the driver said, unhitching one of the horses. "You two stay with the coach. I can make Timber Creek in an hour if I ride hard." "You can't leave us here with a storm coming," Sophia protested, looking at the elderly man now sitting weakly on a rock. "No choice, Mr. Henderson there can't ride and I can't leave him. Coach will give some shelter. I'll be back with help soon as I can." Before she could argue further, the driver was mounted and galloping away, leaving Sophia and the elderly gentleman alone on the vast prairie as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Vaughn spotted the overturned stagecoach just as the sky opened. Rain pelted his duster as he urged his horse forward, instantly alert to trouble. He'd been tracking strays along the eastern ridge when the storm rolled in faster than expected, forcing him to seek shelter. The disabled coach was a quarter-mile off the main road, partially hidden by a rise in the land. Drawing closer, he saw a woman struggling to help an older man back inside the tilted vehicle as rain poured down. Her blonde hair had come completely loose, cascading down her back in a golden waterfall now darkening with moisture. Her dress, once blue but now mud-splattered, clung to her form as she fought against the elements. "Need some help there?" Vaughn called over the growing wind, dismounting in one fluid motion. The woman turned, revealing a face that caused Vaughn's practiced detachment to falter. Despite being rain-soaked and distressed, she was strikingly beautiful, with delicate features and eyes that flashed with both relief and wariness. "Our driver went for help," she explained, raising her voice against the storm. "The wheel broke and Mr. Henderson is unwell." Vaughn assessed the situation quickly. "Storm's getting worse. My line shack's less than 2 miles from here. It's not much, but it's dry and has a stove." Thunder cracked overhead, making the decision for them. The older man was shivering violently, his complexion ashen. "I'm Vaughn Fletcher, Double Bar Ranch," he said, helping the gentleman to his feet. "We need to move now before this turns into a real gully washer." "Sophia Nelson," she replied, gathering her scattered belongings. "I was traveling to Timber Creek to stay with my uncle, James Nelson." "The mercantile owner," Vaughn nodded. "Good man." He secured the elderly passenger on his horse and offered his hand to Sophia. "You'll have to ride double with me. Can you manage?" Their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them, recognition of the necessity that forced strangers into sudden intimacy on the frontier. Her hand, despite its delicacy, gripped his firmly as she mounted behind him. "Hold tight," Vaughn instructed, hyper-aware of her arms circling his waist. As they rode through the intensifying storm, Vaughn found himself increasingly conscious of the woman pressed against his back. This unexpected human contact, something he'd deliberately avoided, sent an unwelcome warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The line shack appeared through sheets of rain just as hail began to mix with the downpour. It was a humble structure, little more than 4 walls, a roof, and a small porch, but at that moment it represented salvation. Vaughn helped Mr. Henderson inside first, then turned to assist Sophia, who was already dismounting on her own, her sodden skirts hampering her movements. Their hands met again as he steadied her, and for a brief moment neither moved. "Thank you," she said simply, rainwater tracking down her face like tears. Inside, Vaughn busied himself with practical matters, lighting the stove, finding dry blankets, tending to his horse under the lean-to attached to the shack. Anything to distract from the unfamiliar feeling taking root in his chest. As the storm raged outside, Sophia helped the elderly man into the shack's only chair while Vaughn prepared coffee. The small space, normally a haven of solitude, now felt charged with an energy he couldn't name. "You're fortunate I was out checking strays," Vaughn said, handing her a steaming cup. "This stretch of road can go days without travelers." Sophia accepted the coffee gratefully, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Perhaps fortune has finally remembered me then." Something in her tone, a veiled reference to misfortunes past, caught Vaughn's attention. He found himself wanting to ask more, to understand what shadows darkened her clear green eyes. Instead, he turned away, reminding himself that curiosity about others led to involvement, and involvement inevitably led to pain. Yet as the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, Vaughn Fletcher could not shake the feeling that his carefully constructed beliefs about frontier survival were about to be tested in ways he never anticipated. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world glistening under a newly risen sun. Sophia stepped onto the small porch of the lined shack, breathing deeply of the rain-purified air. Mr. Henderson was still sleeping inside, his condition improved after a night of rest. Vaughn was already outside, checking his horse and gazing toward the distant mountains. There was something compelling about him in this early light, a quiet strength that seemed as much a part of the landscape as the hills themselves. "The driver will likely bring help today," he said without turning, somehow sensing her presence. "Road will be muddy but passable." "You've been very kind," Sophia replied, moving to stand beside him. Her dress had dried overnight, though it was wrinkled beyond salvation. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found us." Vaughn glanced at her, then quickly away, as if her direct gaze made him uncomfortable. Anyone would have done the same. "Perhaps. But it wasn't anyone, it was you." A silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable. In the distance, meadowlarks called to one another, their songs bright against the vast emptiness. "How long have you been in Montana Territory?" she asked finally. "3 years at Double Bar, before that drifting mostly." Vaughn adjusted his hat. "Not much to tell." "Everyone has a story, Mr. Fletcher." His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Out here, the past stays where it belongs, behind you." Sophia studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw despite his youthful features. "Is that why you're alone in this lined shack instead of somewhere more comfortable, keeping the past at bay?" The question clearly caught him off guard. His blue eyes met hers with sudden intensity. "Being alone isn't the same as being lonely, Miss Nelson. It's safer." "Safer for whom?" Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Vaughn's posture shifted instantly, alert and ready, but it was only the stagecoach driver returning with a wagon and another man. "See there," the driver called out upon spotting them, "told you they'd find shelter." "That's Fletcher from Double Bar." Sophia felt a curious mix of relief and disappointment as their rescue arrived. The moment of connection with this solitary cowboy had been broken, and soon she would continue to Timber Creek as planned. Yet something about their brief encounter had awakened questions she couldn't easily dismiss. As they prepared to leave, loading Mr. Henderson carefully into the wagon, Vaughn remained distant, his earlier openness sealed away behind practiced reserve. "Your uncle's store is on the main street," he said, helping her into the wagon. "Can't miss it." "Will I see you in town sometime?" Sophia asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Vaughn's expression revealed nothing. "I don't get to town much." "Well, should you find yourself there, my uncle would surely want to thank you properly for helping his niece." He nodded once, stepping back. "Safe travels, Miss Nelson." As the wagon pulled away, Sophia found herself looking back at the solitary figure standing beside the humble lined shack. There was something profoundly affecting about Vaughn Fletcher, a man determined to need no one, yet who had not hesitated to help strangers in distress. What she couldn't know was that Vaughn watched the wagon until it disappeared from sight, fighting an unfamiliar urge to follow. Timber Creek proved smaller than Sophia had imagined from her uncle's letters. A single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a church whose white steeple seemed to punctuate the wide Montana sky, and scattered houses extending outward like ripples from a stone dropped in water. Uncle James welcomed her with genuine warmth to his comfortable home behind the mercantile. A widower of 15 years, he seemed delighted to have family under his roof again. "Your room is upstairs, my dear," he said, carrying her salvaged carpetbag. "I had Mrs. Holloway from down the street fix it up for you. Simple, but I think you'll be comfortable." The room was indeed simple but thoughtfully prepared. A quilt in blues and whites covered the iron bed frame, curtains of matching fabric framed the window overlooking the street, and a small writing desk sat beneath it. "It's perfect, Uncle James," Sophia said sincerely. After the harrowing journey, even this modest space felt luxurious. "Rest today," her uncle advised. "Tomorrow I'll show you the store and introduce you around town. Folks here are good people, straightforward, hardworking." Alone in her room, Sophia found her thoughts drifting to Vaughn Fletcher. He embodied the frontier spirit her uncle described, capable, self-sufficient, direct. Yet there was more beneath that composed exterior, something wounded that resonated with her own recent heartaches. In the days that followed, Sophia quickly established herself in Timber Creek. Her uncle's mercantile became her domain during business hours, her natural grace with customers and head for figures proving invaluable. The townsfolk welcomed her with curiosity and kindness, though she noticed the assessing glances of several unmarried men. "James Nelson's niece is quite the catch," she overheard in the mercantile one afternoon. "Eastern education, pretty as a picture, and stands to inherit the store someday." The conversation reminded her painfully of Edward and his mercenary abandonment. She had come west partly to escape such calculations, not to become the subject of new ones. Nearly 3 weeks passed before Vaughn Fletcher appeared in town. Sophia was arranging a display of calico when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway, hat in hand, looking decidedly uncomfortable among the shelves of domestic goods. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, unable to keep surprise and pleasure from her voice. "Welcome." He nodded, his eyes taking in the transformed space. Under Sophia's influence, the mercantile had become more organized and inviting, with goods artfully displayed rather than merely stacked. "Need supplies," he said simply. "Thought I'd try Nelson's this time." Of course, she smiled, noting how different he looked in town, still handsome but somehow constrained by civilization. "What can I help you with?" He produced a list and she moved around the store gathering the items: coffee, ammunition, tobacco, a new shirt. Their fingers brushed as she handed him each selection, and each time she felt that same curious spark that had flared during their first meeting. "Your uncle mentioned you're staying on," Vaughn said finally, watching her measure coffee beans. "Yes, there's opportunity here for me." Sophia secured the paper package with string. "And will you stay at Double Bar?" For now, his eyes met hers briefly. "Cattle Drive coming up next month. After that, who knows?" The implication that he might move on sent an unexpected pang through her chest. Before she could respond, the door opened again, and Thomas Miller, the banker's son, entered. "Miss Nelson," he exclaimed with obvious delight, "I was hoping to catch you. Father's hosting a social at our home this Saturday. The whole town's invited." His eyes flickered to Vaughn, acknowledging him with the barest nod before returning to Sophia. "I do hope you'll attend." "That's very kind, Mr. Miller. I'll have to check with my uncle's plans." Thomas beamed. "Excellent, I'll save you a dance." With another pointed look at Vaughn, he departed. An awkward silence followed. Vaughn began gathering his purchases. "You should go," he said finally. "Good way to meet people." Sophia busied herself with totaling his bill. "Perhaps, though I find some social events rather calculating." Vaughn raised an eyebrow, waiting for elaboration. "Incent." "Louis, I was engaged," she admitted, the words escaping before she could reconsider. "When my father died and our financial situation was revealed, my fiancé discovered his affections were less enduring than expected." Understanding dawned in Vaughn's eyes. "So you came west." "To start fresh, yes." She handed him his change. "I've learned that people who pursue you for advantage can abandon you just as quickly when circumstances change." For the first time, Vaughn's expression softened. "Seems we've both learned similar lessons, Miss Nelson." The moment stretched between them, a recognition of shared wounds despite their different paths. "Will you attend the social?" she asked impulsively. He shook his head, returning to his usual reserve. "Cowboys aren't much welcome at bankers' parties." "That's a shame." Sophia held his gaze steadily. "I would welcome your presence." Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps even yearning, before he carefully shuttered it away. "Thank you for the supplies, Miss Nelson." As he left, Sophia stood watching his retreating figure through the window, puzzling over the contradictions in this man who seemed determined to remain untouched by connection yet could not entirely hide his longing for it. The cattle drive preparations consumed Vaughn's days, a welcome distraction from thoughts of Sophia Nelson. Double Bar was sending 2,000 head to the railhead at Billings, a journey that would take weeks of hard riding across difficult terrain. Thinking of wintering in town this year, Hank mentioned as they mended tack in the barn, getting too old for bunkhouse living. Vaughn grunted noncommittally, focusing on the leather in his hands. Heard Nelson's niece is drawing quite a crowd at the mercantile, the older cowhand continued casually. Pretty thing, they say, smart too. Wouldn't know, Vaughn lied, testing the repaired bridle for strength. Hank chuckled. Sure you wouldn't, just like you wouldn't know anything about riding 15 miles to town last week when we only needed supplies from the closer trading post. Vaughn shot him a warning glance, which Hank ignored with the privilege of long acquaintance. Frontier's changing, son, ain't just survival anymore. Towns growing, families starting. Man might consider putting down roots before all the good land and good women are claimed. I'm not interested in claims of any kind, Vaughn replied sharply, gathering his tools. Just doing my job until the drive. But later, alone in his bunk, Vaughn found himself remembering the forthright way Sophia had shared her painful past, as if offering him a chance to reveal his own. Few had ever looked at him with such honest interest, seeing beyond the capable cowboy to the man beneath. Against his better judgment, Vaughn found himself riding into Timber Creek again the following Saturday. He told himself it was for additional supplies forgotten in his previous visit. The fact that it coincided with the banker's social was merely coincidence. The mercantile was closed early for the event, a disappointment he wouldn't acknowledge. Instead, Vaughn found himself at the Broken Spoke Saloon, nursing a whiskey and fighting the ridiculous urge to walk past the banker's well-lit home where piano music and laughter spilled onto the street. "Fletcher," a voice called. "Didn't expect to see you in town." Sheriff Wade Davis pulled out a chair at Vaughn's table. The lawman was one of the few people in Timber Creek that Vaughn genuinely respected, honest, straightforward, and not given to unnecessary conversation. "Just passing through," Vaughn replied, raising his glass slightly. "Heard you rescued James Nelson's niece during that big storm last month," Davis said. "Good thing you found them when you did. Henderson might not have made it otherwise." Vaughn shrugged. "Right place, right time. She's made quite an impression on the town," the sheriff continued. "Breathed new life into that mercantile. James is talking about expanding now." Despite himself, Vaughn found himself asking, "She planning to stay on permanently?" Davis nodded toward the window. "Seems likely, given how quickly she's taken to frontier life. There she is now." Vaughn turned to see Sophia walking past the saloon, arm in arm with Thomas Miller. She wore a dress of deep green that matched her eyes, her honey-blonde hair arranged elegantly beneath a modest hat. She was laughing at something Miller said, looking every inch a proper town lady. The sight struck Vaughn with unexpected force. Of course she belonged in town, among civilized people who could offer her a stable future. What could a cowboy with nothing but a saddle to his name provide that would compare to a banker's son with property and prospects? "Another whiskey," Vaughn called to the bartender, turning away from the window. The sheriff studied him with knowing eyes. "You know, Fletcher, a man can only ride the lonely trail so long before he starts wondering what he's missing." "I'm not missing anything," Vaughn said flatly. "I've got exactly the life I want." But later, as he rode back to Double Bar under a canopy of stars, Vaughn couldn't shake the hollow feeling in his chest, a sensation uncomfortably close to longing for something he'd convinced himself he didn't need. The Miller social proved every bit as calculating as Sophia had feared. Thomas Miller's attentions were transparent in their intent, his father's approving glances making it clear that a union between the banker's son and the mercantile heiress would be advantageous for all concerned. "You've made quite an impression on our Thomas," Mrs. Miller confided as they watched the dancing. "He's been so particular about his prospects, we despaired of him ever finding a suitable match here in Timber Creek." Sophia smiled politely, while inwardly recoiling at the familiar mercenary assessment. "Thomas has been very welcoming, as has everyone in town." "Of course, dear, we're also pleased to have new blood, especially someone with your refinement. Frontier towns need civilizing influences." As the evening progressed, Sophia found herself increasingly withdrawn despite the animated conversations around her. Thomas had claimed his dance and two more besides, his hand lingering a bit too long on her waist, his conversation filled with thinly veiled references to their compatible future prospects. When she stepped outside for air, the night breeze was a welcome relief from the stuffiness within. From the porch, she could see most of the small town, including the warm glow of the saloon down the street. A familiar figure emerged from it, tall, straight-backed, unmistakably Vaughn even at this distance. Her heart quickened inexplicably. He was in town after all. Had he considered coming to the social? Was he perhaps as drawn to their connection as she found herself to be? "There you are," Thomas's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I was worried you'd slipped away." Sophia turned, composing her features. "Just getting some fresh air." Thomas moved closer, his cologne overwhelming in the confined space. "I've been hoping for a moment alone with you. We've gotten along so well these past weeks, and I feel we have a real understanding between us." "Mr. Miller." "Thomas, please," he took her hand. "Sophia, I think you know my intentions. A woman of your quality deserves security and position. Together we could build something substantial here, the bank, the mercantile, perhaps even a family." The proposal, however obliquely phrased, hung in the air between them. Sophia gently withdrew her hand. "You honor me with your regard, but I think perhaps you're moving rather quickly," she said carefully. "We've known each other a very short time." Thomas's expression faltered briefly before recovering. "Of course I'm too eager, but promise you'll consider my suit. There's no better match in Timber Creek for either of us." The calculated nature of his interest was so transparent that Sophia felt a wave of dejection wash over her. Had she traveled all this way only to find the same mercenary approach to marriage that she'd fled in St. Louis? "I should return inside. My uncle will be looking for me." As she rejoined the gathering, Sophia found herself comparing Thomas Miller's practiced courtship to Vaughn Fletcher's reluctant honesty. One man pursued her for advantage while calculating what she could bring him. The other had rescued her without expectation, shared his shelter, then deliberately kept his distance. She realized with sudden clarity that she had seen more genuine feeling in Vaughn's guarded blue eyes than in all of Thomas's flowery declarations. The cattle drive preparations entered their final days. Vaughn threw himself into work with singular focus, determined to exhaust himself too thoroughly for unwelcome thoughts of green eyes and honey-blonde hair. 2,000 cattle would require constant vigilance on the long journey to Billings, leaving no time for distraction. "Last supply run to town tomorrow," the foreman announced over dinner. "Fletcher, take the wagon and get what's on this list. We head out at dawn the day after." Vaughn nodded, accepting the assignment with mixed feelings. One final trip to Timber Creek, one last chance to see Sophia before the weeks-long drive took him far away. Perhaps by the time he returned, she would be engaged to Thomas Miller or some other promising townsman, and these unsettling feelings would finally be laid to rest. The mercantile was busy when he arrived the next morning. Sophia moved efficiently among the customers, her manner warm yet professional. She noticed him immediately, a flicker of recognition passing across her face before she returned to helping an elderly woman select fabric. Vaughn busied himself gathering items from his list, content to wait. The store had continued to evolve under Sophia's influence, becoming more organized and welcoming. He could see why customers lingered, why her uncle looked so proud as he tallied purchases at the counter. "Mr. Fletcher," Sophia approached when the rush had subsided. "How can I help you today?" "Drive supplies," he replied, handing her the list. "Heading out tomorrow." "The cattle drive," she nodded, gathering the requested items. "How long will you be gone?" 3 weeks, maybe 4, depending on weather and river crossings. Sophia continued working, her movements efficient yet somehow betraying tension. "I imagine it's dangerous work." "It can be." Vaughn watched her hands as she measured coffee beans. "Stampedes are the biggest risk, rivers too, but we've got experienced men." She looked up at him then, something unspoken in her gaze. "Will you return to Double Bar afterward?" The question caught him off guard. "That's the plan." Sophia seemed about to say more when the door opened, admitting Thomas Miller with a bouquet of flowers. He faltered momentarily upon seeing Vaughn before recovering his composure. "Sophia, my dear," he greeted warmly, completely ignoring Vaughn, "I thought these might brighten your day." "How thoughtful, Thomas." She accepted the flowers with polite grace. "I'll just find something to put these in, mister." Fletcher is gathering supplies for a cattle drive. Thomas glanced at Vaughn with thinly veiled contempt. Yes, I heard Double Bar was driving stock to Billings, dangerous business. Not everyone returns from such journeys. The implied wish was unmistakable. Vaughn's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. Risk is part of the job. Indeed, Thomas smiled without warmth. Sophia, I was hoping you might join me for dinner this evening. Father has some matters he'd like to discuss regarding potential partnership between our businesses. Vaughn busied himself examining a box of ammunition, trying to appear disinterested even as something cold settled in his stomach. I'm afraid I've already promised to help Uncle James with inventory tonight, Sophia replied, returning with the flowers now arranged in a simple vase. Perhaps another time. Thomas's disappointment was evident, but he recovered quickly. Of course, business first, one of the many qualities I admire in you. He took her hand, pressing it briefly to his lips. Until next time. After he departed, an awkward silence filled the space between them. Vaughn resumed gathering supplies while Sophia moved the flowers to a shelf near the window. He seems determined, Vaughn commented finally, unable to help himself. Sophia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes. Very determined indeed. Good match, Vaughn forced himself to say. Bank and mercantile makes sense. She turned to him then, her green eyes searching his face. Does it? I thought I left calculations like that behind in St. Louis. The comment hung between them, loaded with meaning. Vaughn found himself at a crossroads, pursue this conversation and risk revealing more than he intended, or retreat behind his practiced detachment. Some men know a good thing when they see it, he said finally, choosing the safer path. Can't blame him for trying. Disappointment flickered across her features. No, I suppose not. She finished gathering his supplies with brisk efficiency. Will that be all, Mr. Fletcher? The formality stung more than it should have. That's everything. As he paid for his purchases, their fingers brushed briefly. Vaughn found himself wanting to say something more, something to bridge the growing distance between them, but the words wouldn't come. Safe journey, Mr. Fletcher, Sophia said as he gathered his packages. I hope the drive goes well. Thank you, Miss Nelson. He paused at the door, turning back. Take care of yourself. It was woefully inadequate, but it was all he could offer. As he loaded the wagon, Vaughn told himself this was for the best. The cattle drive would put physical distance between them, and by the time he returned, perhaps these unwelcome feelings would have faded for both of them. What he didn't see was Sophia watching him from the window, one hand pressed against the glass, her expression a complex mixture of longing and resignation. 2 weeks into the cattle drive, disaster struck. A sudden thunderstorm spooked the herd, triggering a nighttime stampede that scattered cattle across 5 miles of rough country. In the chaos, Vaughn was thrown from his horse while trying to turn the lead steers, his body slammed against an outcropping of rock before tumbling down a shallow ravine. He woke to searing pain and Hank's weathered face hovering above him. Don't move, son, that's a nasty break. Vaughn's left leg was indeed broken, the bone thankfully not protruding through skin but visibly misaligned beneath his torn pants. His ribs screamed with every breath, suggesting at least one fracture there as well. The herd, he managed to ask through gritted teeth, lost about 200 head. Could have been worse. Hank shook his head. You're in no shape to continue. We'll need to get you back to town. The next few days passed in a blur of pain as Hank and another hand transported Vaughn back to Timber Creek in a jolting wagon. The town doctor set his leg, wrapped his ribs, and prescribed strict bed rest, an impossible luxury for a cowhand with no home beyond the bunkhouse. He can recover at my place, Sheriff Davis offered, overhearing the doctor's instructions. Got a spare room since my deputy moved out. And so Vaughn found himself confined to a narrow bed in the sheriff's modest home, his body healing but his spirits darkening with each passing day. The broken bones would mend, the doctor assured him, but it would be months before he could ride properly again, months before he could work cattle, earn his keep, maintain the independence that defined him. Double Bar's foreman sent word, Davis informed him a week into his convalescence. Says your job will be waiting when you're healed up. In the meantime, you're welcome to stay on here. Vaughn stared at the ceiling, feeling the walls of dependence closing in. I can't impose indefinitely. It's hardly imposing when you're paying your way, the sheriff countered. I've needed help with paperwork for months. You can read and write better than most, might as well make yourself useful while that leg heals. It was charity dressed as opportunity, but Vaughn had few options. The meager savings from his last pay wouldn't last long, and pride was a luxury he suddenly couldn't afford. News of his injury spread quickly through the small town. Various townsfolk stopped by with food or offers of assistance, their kindness simultaneously touching and uncomfortable for a man accustomed to relying solely on himself. He was struggling to dress himself one morning, balancing precariously on his good leg, when a knock at the door interrupted his frustrated efforts. Sheriff Davis said to come in, Sophia's voice called hesitantly. Vaughn froze, one arm halfway through his shirt sleeve. Just a minute, he managed, hastily pulling the shirt on and reaching for the crutches propped against the wall. When he opened the door, Sophia stood in the hallway holding a covered basket. Her eyes widened slightly at his disheveled appearance, then softened with concern. I heard about the stampede, she said. I brought some things from the store, foods that keep well, books to pass the time. Vaughn stepped back awkwardly on his crutches, allowing her to enter the small room. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. She set the basket on the table, glancing around the sparse accommodations. How are you managing? Well enough. He lowered himself carefully to the edge of the bed. Doctor says the leg will heal clean if I stay off it. Sophia nodded, her gaze taking in the dark circles under his eyes, the strain evident in his posture. And how are you really, Vaughn? The use of his first name, spoken with such gentle directness, cracked something in his carefully maintained facade. Useless, he admitted, the word escaping before he could stop it. Dependent, everything I swore I'd never be. Understanding dawned in her expression, because depending on others makes us vulnerable. Yes, their eyes met in shared recognition of this fundamental truth. Sophia moved to sit beside him on the bed, close but not touching. After my father died and Edward abandoned me, I thought I needed to rely only on myself as well. Coming west seemed the perfect solution, a fresh start where I could prove my independence. And have you? Vaughn asked, genuinely curious. A small smile curved her lips. I've discovered something unexpected instead. True independence isn't about needing no one, it's about choosing who to need, who to trust. The concept struck Vaughn with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on avoiding dependence entirely that he'd never considered there might be people worthy of his trust, people whose support wouldn't inevitably lead to heartbreak. Your uncle, he asked. He's part of it, she agreed. But also the community here, different from what I expected, but there's honesty in how people depend on each other out here. It's not the calculated exchanges I knew back east. Vaughn thought of the townsfolk who'd brought food, offered assistance, asked after his health with genuine concern. Different indeed from his lonely existence at Double Bar. Thomas Miller has formally asked to court me, Sophia said suddenly, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. The statement hit Vaughn like a physical blow. Congratulations, he managed, the word tasting like ash. I haven't accepted. She looked up then, her gaze direct. He offers security and position, all the practical considerations a woman alone should value. But, Vaughn prompted, hardly daring to breathe. But I find myself thinking of a man who rescued strangers in a storm without calculation, who shared his shelter and supplies expecting nothing in return. Her voice softened. A man who rides 15 miles to town, claiming to need supplies available much closer to his ranch. Heat rose in Vaughn's face. Hank talks too much. A smile touched her lips. I'm glad he does, she hesitated, then continued with quiet intensity. I don't want a match based on advantage, Vaughn. I had that in St. Louis and it proved worthless when circumstances changed. The implication hung between them, charged with possibility. Vaughn found himself at another crossroads, retreat into safety or risk the vulnerability of truth. I have nothing to offer, he said finally, a cowhand with a broken leg. No property, no prospects. Perhaps I'm not looking for what you think, Sophia's gaze held his steadily. Perhaps I've seen something in you worth far more than Thomas Miller's bank accounts or business prospects. The moment stretched between them, fragile and momentous. Vaughn realized with startling clarity that his long-held belief that love and connection were liabilities on the frontier was being directly challenged by the woman before him. Before he could respond, footsteps in the hallway announced the sheriff's return. Sophia stood quickly, smoothing her skirts. "I should go, Uncle will be wondering where I am." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I'll come again tomorrow if you'd like." "I would," Vaughn said simply, the admission feeling like the first step on an unfamiliar trail. Her smile as she left contained a promise that lingered long after she'd gone. True to her word, Sophia returned the following day and the next after that. Their conversations ranged widely: her childhood in St. Louis, his years working cattle across 3 territories, books they had read, dreams they had abandoned, beliefs that had shaped them. With each visit, Vaughn found himself sharing more than he had with anyone since leaving Missouri. The wall he had built between himself and others began to develop cracks, allowing glimpses of the man he might become if he dared to believe in connection again. "My parents had a rare kind of love," he admitted one rainy afternoon as they played checkers on his bed. "When my mother died of fever, my father simply gave up, followed her within the month. The doctor said his heart just stopped, but I knew better, it had simply broken without her." Sophia moved a checker thoughtfully. "And that scared you?" "Terrified me," Vaughn corrected. "I swore I'd never become so dependent on another person that losing them would destroy me." "So you chose to be alone instead." "Seemed safer." He captured one of her pieces. "What about you? Before Edward, did you believe in that kind of love?" Sophia considered the question, her expression thoughtful. "I believed in partnership, in building something together. My parents had that, not the grand passion of poetry perhaps, but deep respect and affection. When father died, mother carried on. She grieved, but she also adapted." "And now," Vaughn asked, watching her closely. A smile touched her lips. "Now I believe there must be balance, to love deeply without being consumed by it. To build a future together, without losing oneself entirely in the process." The concept resonated with something growing in Vaughn's heart, a vision of connection that didn't require complete surrender of self, of love as strength rather than weakness. As weeks passed and his body slowly healed, Vaughn found himself increasingly integrated into Timber Creek. The sheriff's deputy work, initially accepted out of necessity, proved surprisingly satisfying. His knowledge of the surrounding territory proved valuable, and his fair-minded approach to disputes earned respect. "Ever consider taking on the badge permanently?" Davis asked one evening as they reviewed wanted posters. "You've got a knack for keeping the peace without drawing your gun." The suggestion would have been unthinkable months earlier, but now Vaughn found himself considering it. "Thought I'd go back to double bar when the leg heals." Davis shrugged. "Options there if you want it. Town's growing, could use another full-time deputy soon." Thomas Miller's pursuit of Sophia continued unabated, his visits to the mercantile becoming more frequent, his gifts more elaborate. Each time Sophia mentioned him, Vaughn felt a twist of something dark in his chest, even as he told himself he had no right to such feelings. "He's invited me to dinner with his parents again," she mentioned during one visit. "To discuss our future," according to the note. Vaughn focused intently on the book in his hands, struggling to maintain his composure. "Sounds serious." "It is." Sophia watched him, waiting for a response he couldn't bring himself to offer. The unspoken hung between them. Despite their growing closeness, Vaughn had carefully avoided any declaration of his feelings, convinced that he had no right to compete with what Miller could provide. "I should let you rest," Sophia said finally, gathering her things. Her disappointment was palpable. "The doctor says you might try walking without the crutches soon." "Sophia," Vaughn began, then faltered. What could he say? That he thought of her constantly, that he dreaded her eventual acceptance of Miller's suit, that despite everything he believed about frontier survival, he found himself wanting a future with her in it. She paused at the door, hope flickering briefly in her eyes before resignation replaced it. "Good night, Vaughn." After she left, Vaughn stared at the ceiling for hours, wrestling with the growing realization that his carefully constructed beliefs about independence were crumbling in the face of what he felt for Sophia Nelson. The Autumn Harvest Festival approached, an important social event in Timber Creek's calendar. Despite his healing leg, Vaughn had declined attending, uncomfortable with the prospect of watching Sophia and Thomas Miller together amid the celebration. Instead, he sat on the sheriff's porch, watching distant lanterns illuminate the town square as music and laughter drifted on the evening breeze. His leg ached less now, and he could walk short distances with only a slight limp. Soon he would need to decide, return to Double Bar as planned or consider the sheriff's offer of permanent deputy work. "Thought I'd find you hiding out here," Hank's familiar voice broke into his thoughts. The old cowhand approached the porch, looking strange in clean clothes and a fresh haircut. "Not hiding," Vaughn protested, "just resting the leg." Hank snorted, settling onto the neighboring chair. "Sure, and I'm the Queen of England." He studied Vaughn's face critically. "You're a fool, boy." "Excuse me." "You heard me?" Hank leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "I've watched you these past years, building walls higher than fortress mountains. Telling yourself you're better off alone." Vaughn stiffened. "That's my business." "Is it? Then why do you look like a man watching his last chance ride away?" Hank gestured toward the distant festivities. "That Nelson girl has been waiting for you to speak up for months. Meanwhile, Miller circles like a vulture with a pocket full of promises." "She deserves what he can offer," Vaughn replied tightly. "Security, position. A future." Hank laughed, the sound lacking humor. "You think that's what she's looking for? Girl could have had that back east. She came west for something different." The observation struck uncomfortably close to Vaughn's own unacknowledged hopes. "What do you know about it?" "More than you'd think," Hank's expression softened. "Had a wife once back in Texas. Lost her to fever before we could start the family we planned. Thought I'd never risk that pain again, so I rode away. Became the drifting cowhand, moving on whenever connections started forming." The parallel to Vaughn's own choices was unmistakable. 30 years later, here I am," Hank continued. "Old, alone, with nothing but memories of campfires and cattle. And you know what keeps me awake some nights? Not the woman I lost, but the life I could have built after her if I'd found the courage to try again." The words landed with the force of truth, compelling Vaughn to confront his own fears. Was he really protecting himself from pain, or merely guaranteeing a different kind of suffering, the slow ache of opportunity lost, of connection denied? "It might be too late," Vaughn admitted, voicing his deepest fear. "Miller's been courting her properly. What can I offer that compares?" Hank stood, adjusting his hat. "Only one way to find out, son. But sitting here feeling sorry for yourself surely won't win the lady." He stepped off the porch. "Festival runs till midnight, still time to make an appearance if a man had something important to say." After Hank departed, Vaughn remained motionless, his thoughts in turmoil. The comfortable certainties that had guided his life were dissolving, replaced by questions he could no longer avoid. What if his father's devotion wasn't weakness but strength of a different kind? What if connection, rather than making the frontier more dangerous, was what made its hardships bearable? What if the real risk wasn't in loving Sophia, but in letting her go without ever declaring himself? With sudden decision, Vaughn stood, testing his weight on his healing leg. It held. Retrieving his hat and coat, he set out toward the festival lights, each step both painful and purposeful. The town square had been transformed with lanterns and harvest decorations, tables laden with food surrounding a cleared area for dancing. Vaughn moved carefully through the crowd, nodding at greetings but focused on finding Sophia. He spotted her at the edge of the dance floor, engaged in conversation with several townswomen. She wore a dress of deep blue that brought out the gold in her hair, which was arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Even from a distance, she outshone every other woman present. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, surprise and pleasure washing across her features before she excused herself from the group. They met at the edge of the celebration, slightly apart from the crowd. "Vaughn, I didn't expect to see you here." Her smile warmed him like sunrise. "How is your leg?" "Better," he said, suddenly unsure how to proceed now that he'd found her. "Thought I should see what all the excitement was about." Sophia's eyes searched his, as if looking for the real reason behind his appearance. "I'm glad you came. It's a lovely tradition, the whole town gathering before winter sets in." Vaughn nodded, distracted by the approaching figure of Thomas Miller, whose expression darkened upon recognizing him. Sophia, Miller greeted, pointedly ignoring Vaughn. They're beginning the Virginia reel. I believe you promised me this dance. His proprietary tone grated on Vaughn's nerves. Sophia hesitated, glancing between the two men. Actually, I was just catching up with Mr. Fletcher, she said carefully. Miller's smile thinned. Surely he won't mind waiting. His condition likely prevents dancing anyway. The deliberate reference to Vaughn's injury hung in the air like a challenge. Sophia's expression hardened. Thomas, that's unkind, she said quietly but firmly. Please excuse us for a moment. Miller's face flushed with anger, but he retreated with a stiff bow. Of course. I'll await your convenience. When he was out of earshot, Sophia turned apologetically to Vaughn. I'm sorry about that. No need, Vaughn watched Miller's retreating back. He's staked his claim pretty clearly. His claim, Sophia repeated, her tone suddenly cooling. I wasn't aware I belonged to anyone, Mr. Fletcher. Vaughn realized his mistake immediately. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Her green eyes flashed with sudden fire. For months you've visited with me, shared your thoughts, accepted my care, yet you've never once indicated that your interest might extend beyond friendship. Meanwhile, you seem perfectly content to assume I'll eventually accept Thomas's suit, as if I have no mind of my own in the matter. Her unexpected directness left Vaughn momentarily speechless. The truth of her words struck home. He had indeed assumed decisions about her future without ever declaring his own feelings or asking about hers. You're right, he admitted finally. I've been a coward. The simple acknowledgement seemed to catch her off guard. What? Vaughn took a deep breath, committing himself to a path from which there would be no return. I came here tonight to tell you something I should have said weeks ago, maybe months ago. Around them, the festival continued, but Vaughn was aware only of Sophia, her expression a mixture of wariness and hope. I've spent years believing that needing no one was the only way to survive out here, he continued. That connections were dangerous, that love was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. I watched my father die of a broken heart, and I swore I'd never be that vulnerable. Sophia's expression softened. Vaughn. Please let me finish. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Then I met you. You challenged everything I believed. You showed me that strength can come from connection, not just from isolation. The music from the dance floor swelled around them, but neither moved. I have no right to ask this, Vaughn continued, his voice rough with emotion. I can't offer what Miller can, not yet anyway, but I need to know if there's any chance. If you could ever consider a future with someone like me. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Sophia's eyes glistened in the lantern light as she studied his face. You truly don't know, do you? She said finally, wonder in her voice. After all this time, you still don't see it. See what? That I've been waiting for you to ask. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling. That I've turned down Thomas's proposals 3 times already because my heart was already given elsewhere. Hope bloomed in Vaughn's chest, tentative yet powerful. Sophia. I don't want security purchased at the price of my freedom, she continued. I don't want a calculated match based on business advantage. I want a partner who sees me, truly sees me, and stands beside me as we build something together. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. I want you, Vaughn Fletcher, with your doubts and your scars and your stubborn independence. I want the man who rescued strangers in a storm and never expected thanks. The man who listens when I speak and sees beyond what others expect. Vaughn felt something long frozen within him crack open, releasing a flood of emotion he'd held at bay for years. With trembling hands, he reached for hers. I love you, he said simply, the words both terrifying and liberating. I think I have since that storm. I just didn't know how to reconcile it with everything I believed. And now, she asked, her fingers entwining with his. Now I believe there might be a different kind of strength in loving someone, that maybe we're stronger together than apart. Sophia's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Together we'll build a future worth fighting for, she whispered. That's what I want, Vaughn, not Thomas Miller's bank accounts or social position, just you and me facing whatever comes together. Around them, the festival continued unaware of the momentous shift that had occurred between them. Vaughn felt lighter than he had in years, as if a burden he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its weight had finally been lifted. "Your leg might not be ready for dancing," Sophia said, her eyes sparkling, "but perhaps we could walk a little. There's a harvest moon rising that shouldn't be missed." As they moved away from the crowd, Vaughn noticed Thomas Miller watching them, his expression dark with comprehension. The banker's son gave a stiff nod of acknowledgement before turning away. Under the rising harvest moon, Vaughn and Sophia walked slowly along the edge of town, his slight limp matching her measured pace as if they had always been meant to move in tandem. Their future held uncertainty, his healing leg, her uncle's business, the question of where they would make their home, but for the first time Vaughn faced uncertainty without dread. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and somehow that made all the difference. Spring arrived in Montana territory with its customary drama, lingering snowstorms giving way suddenly to days of brilliant sunshine, dormant grasses greening overnight, wildflowers erupting across the prairie in waves of color. The transformation of the landscape mirrored the transformation in Vaughn Fletcher's life. The small cabin took shape on the plot of land where he had once rescued Sophia during a storm, 20 acres purchased with his savings combined with money from the sale of her St. Louis inheritance. The location was strategic, far enough from town for privacy, close enough to allow Sophia to help at the mercantile and Vaughn to fulfill his duties as deputy sheriff. "Roof's almost finished," Vaughn called down to Sophia, who was arranging stones for the front path. "Should have it sealed before the next rain." She shaded her eyes to look up at him, her honey-blonde hair gleaming in the sunlight. "It's coming together beautifully." The past months had brought changes neither could have anticipated. After his leg healed, Vaughn had accepted Sheriff Davis's offer of a permanent position, discovering unexpected satisfaction in work that utilized his knowledge of the territory and innate sense of justice. The regular income had allowed him to begin building their home, modest but sturdy, with enough land for a garden and eventually a small herd. Sophia had continued working alongside her uncle, whose health had begun to fail during the winter. The arrangement suited all parties. James gained needed assistance, Sophia maintained her independence while helping family, and the elderly gentleman found comfort knowing his business would eventually pass to his niece and her husband. Uncle James sent word that the furniture we ordered from Denver arrived on yesterday's stage, Sophia mentioned as Vaughn climbed down from the roof. "A bed frame, table and chairs, enough to begin with." Vaughn nodded, his eyes taking in the cabin with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Never had he imagined himself building a permanent home, planting roots in community soil. Yet here he stood with a woman who had changed everything. "1 week," he said, pulling her close despite his sweat-dampened shirt. "1 more week and it'll be ready." Sophia leaned into his embrace, her arms circling his waist. Just in time for the wedding. The simple ceremony was planned for the following Saturday at the small church in Timber Creek. Nothing elaborate, just friends, Sophia's uncle, Vaughn's fellow ranch hands from Double Bar, and the community that had become their extended family. "Having second thoughts?" Vaughn asked, only half joking. Even now, part of him wondered if she might regret choosing a former cowhand over the security Thomas Miller had offered. Sophia pulled back to meet his gaze directly. "Not a single one," she assured him. "This is everything I want, a home we've built together, work that matters to both of us, a future that's ours to shape." The absolute certainty in her voice vanquished his lingering doubts. This was what he had feared for so long, the vulnerability of loving someone so completely, yet he found it brought strength rather than weakness, possibility rather than limitation. "You've changed me," he admitted, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Everything I believed about survival out here." "We've changed each other," she corrected gently, "and we'll keep changing as we build our life together. That's what partnership means." As the sunset painted the half-finished cabin in hues of gold and rose, Vaughn realized that the frontier had taught him its final, most important lesson. True survival wasn't about isolation or self-reliance, but about finding the courage to build connections that made life's hardships bearable and its joys multiplied. 1 week later, Vaughn stood at the altar of Timber Creek's small church, watching Sophia walk toward him on her uncle's arm. Her dress was simple but elegant, her smile radiant as their eyes met across the crowded room. As they exchanged vows, promises to love, honor, and cherish through whatever the frontier might bring, Vaughn felt the last of his old beliefs fall away, replaced by a new understanding of strength, of home, of love. "Together we'll build a future worth fighting for," he whispered as he slipped the gold band onto her finger. Sophia's eyes glistened with tears of joy as she repeated the phrase back to him, not just words, but a covenant between two souls who had found in each other what the frontier had seemed determined to deny them. Belonging, partnership, and a love strong enough to weather any storm. And in that moment, surrounded by the community they had come to call family, Vaughn Fletcher finally understood what his father had known all along: that love wasn't a weakness to be avoided, but the very foundation upon which a meaningful life was built. Not just on the frontier, but anywhere two hearts were brave enough to choose each other, again and again, through whatever life might bring.